Hi, let's talk about some basics in this chapter about metabolism, ATP, energy, and enzymes. Energy in biology is the ability to do work, specifically cellular work. And we have potential energy and kinetic energy that we need to know about. Potential energy includes chemical bonds, like the bonds in a carbohydrate or a fatty acid that can be used for energy, and also kinetic energy. Kinetic energy is the energy of movement, but this also includes heat and light are also kinetic energy. Another type of potential energy would be ion gradients, and these are going to be really important when we get to respiration and photosynthesis. An ion gradient would be across a membrane, so that would mean we have a lot of one ion on one side of the membrane and less of it on the other side of the membrane, and this produces an inequality that is sort of like having water behind a dam. You can allow those ions to flow across the membrane like water across a dam and do work with that energy. So potential energy here in this little textbook example would be like if you have something up at the top of a hill, it has some gravitational potential energy. If it rolls down the hill, now it has kinetic energy. So we need to know about the first and the second law of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics is fairly easy to understand. Energy is only converted from one form to another. It is not created or destroyed. So photosynthetic plants don't make energy. They are just taking the energy of light and converting it into the energy found in sugars, fats, and proteins. Energy is changed from one form to another. So for example, when you burn wood in the fireplace, you're taking the energy stored in the chemical bonds of mostly cellulose in the wood and turning it into the energy of heat and light. Let's say another way we can convert energy, kinetic energy, can also be converted into other kinds of energy. So let's say an asteroid strikes the Earth, even a small one does this. It's moving extremely rapidly, and the kinetic energy is a function of the speed and the mass. So the faster it's going and the more it weighs, the more energy it has. And when it strikes the Earth, or even if it's in the upper atmosphere, it's losing velocity as it slows down. And if it hits land or the ocean, it loses all of its velocity. And all of that kinetic energy is going to be converted into other energy. It's going to be the energy of heat and light from the energy of velocity times mass. And it can be enough energy if it's a large enough asteroid, for example, it can actually boil the ocean around it. So that's another case of energy being converted from one form to another. The second law of thermodynamics is the one that's a little bit more difficult to understand because it involves the concept of entropy, which isn't something we normally hear about in everyday speech. Instead, entropy is a concept that was developed first in physics, and entropy is the idea of disorderliness. So if entropy increases, that means disorderliness of the system increases. And if you want to decrease entropy, if you want to make things more orderly, you have to add energy. And this is a good example of that. So if you have a nice clean room and you don't input any energy into keeping it clean, eventually it's going to be very messy. And then so entropy has increased from this nice, neat bedroom to messy, disorderly bedroom. That means that entropy has increased. If you want to lower the entropy of the system, you need to input energy to clean. And that's the confusing part about entropy, is that we want to think about increasing energy, increasing entropy, but it's actually the opposite. Entropy does the opposite of what your energy input is doing. So if a system has high entropy, it's disorderly, it has low energy. If we switch that and we say now it has very low entropy, it's very orderly, that equals high potential energy in that system. So entropy and energy are the opposite. Something that we often hear with from creationists is that life on Earth violates the second law of thermodynamics, which states that in a closed system, entropy always increases because things just tend to become disorderly naturally. If you want to lower the entropy, you have to add energy. So they say, well, you know, during the history of life on Earth, we went from a lifeless planet to a planet that had single cells, to a planet that had orderly life forms, to, you know, the hugely complex array of life forms that we have today, which means that entropy on Earth has decreased. So doesn't that violate the second law? No, because the Earth is not a closed system. And the second law says that in a closed system, entropy will increase. So what's a closed system? A closed system means that energy is not coming in or going out of the system, and mass is not coming in or going out. What's wrong with these birds today? Stop that. Energy and mass are not entering or leaving the system. That's a closed system. So we cannot consider the Earth a closed system because massive amounts of energy are entering the Earth's system every single day from the sun. So if we're going to have a closed system, we have to at least roughly consider the Earth and the sun as that system. And if we do that, is the entropy increasing now? Yes, it is, because our sun is slowly running out of energy. Entropy of the sun is slowly increasing as it becomes more and more disorderly. Our sun is a kind of a smallish star that will have a lifespan of about 20 billion years, and our sun is about 10 billion years old, so it's about halfway through its lifespan. And this is something that's measurable. Astronomers can measure the heat output, the energy output of our sun, and determine how old it is, how far through its lifespan it is. So what's going to happen when our sun runs out of energy in 10 billion years? It's not big enough to go supernova, which is what a large star would do when it runs out of energy. Instead, our sun will go dark, and it will blow it up to about the size of the orbit of the Earth or Mars, and it will become what's called a brown dwarf. That's what's going to happen eventually in 10 billion years. So don't add that to your anxiety worry list. So in chemistry, we like to talk about spontaneous processes. So spontaneous in chemistry doesn't mean quite the same thing as it means in everyday speech. So in everyday speech, spontaneous means that it's something that's going to happen right now, spontaneously. But in chemistry, it just means a reaction that's energetically favored. It's a downhill reaction. We're going from high energy to lower energy. It's just energetically favored. It's something that could happen right now, but maybe it won't. It just means it's energetically favored to react. So for example, burning sugar in the presence of oxygen, or sugar just, instead of saying burning, just reacting with oxygen, and forming carbon dioxide in water and releasing energy in the process. This is a spontaneous reaction. It's downhill. Our reagents here, well, not the oxygen, but the sugar has a high amount of stored potential energy. Carbon dioxide and water have no stored potential energy. All the energy is going to have to be released somehow during this reaction. So this is definitely a spontaneous reaction. However, if I had a bowl of sugar here and I left it out, there's plenty of oxygen in the room, but nothing would happen. No energy would be released. No carbon dioxide and water would form. Why? So just because, and we'll talk about enzymes, they're needed for that at room temperature anyway. You can make this reaction happen by heating it up. So if you take just dry sugar and put it in a pan and heat it up on the stove, this reaction will start to occur eventually if it gets high enough heat. And we'll talk about why that is when we get to the second half of this chapter, the enzymes chapter. So living things do decrease entropy. And even in your life, you've done this. You started out as a single cell. Going from a single cell to an adult that has millions and millions of cells, that is a great decrease in entropy. You are far more orderly and organized than you were when you were a single cell. So that decrease in entropy required energy. All of the energy that you've been taking in the form of food your entire life is how you have managed to decrease your entropy over the course of your lifetime. And it will go in the other direction when you die and you decay. Entropy will be increasing at that point. So the metabolism of organisms is the sum of all the chemical reactions that are occurring in that organism. And we're going to focus on two specific types of reactions in the next two chapters. First, we'll talk about cellular respiration, and second, we will talk about photosynthesis. So cellular respiration is the process of taking potential energy in food molecules, sugars, proteins, and fats, and converting that potential energy into energy of cellular work, muscle contraction, chemical synthesis reactions, moving things across the membrane, moving vesicles around in the cells. Those are all work that are done by cells. And the products are carbon dioxide and water. And you see some heat is released because every time energy is converted from one form to another, it's never 100% efficient. There's always some heat that's lost in the process, which is why when your respiration increases, like if you exercise, you generate a lot of extra heat that we have to get rid of. The opposite process, which we'll talk about second, is photosynthesis. So in photosynthesis, plants and other photosynthetic organisms take sunlight, which is kinetic energy, and convert it into the potential energy of organic molecules like sugars and fats and proteins. And they release oxygen during this process. Well, at least plants and eukaryotic photosynthetic organisms and cyanobacteria do. There is some photosynthesis that does not release oxygen. We'll talk about that too. And even this process of converting sunlight into potential energy and chemical bonds is not 100% efficient, and so heat is released as a byproduct of this reaction. So these two sides of the coin of life on Earth, photosynthesis and then cellular respiration, is most of living things on Earth do these things. Either they do only cellular respiration or they do both photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So plants do both. They have mitochondria, that's where most of our cellular respiration is occurring, and they also perform photosynthesis in their chloroplasts. So we'll talk about those two things in the next two chapters. Anabolic reactions are things that build up bigger molecules from smaller ones. And this is an important thing that cells do. We talked about all of our monomers and polymers, taking amino acids and turning them into proteins, taking nucleotides and turning them into DNA and RNA. Those are anabolic reactions. And in biology, we don't have endothermic reactions like they do in chemistry, meaning reactions that require an input of heat. Instead, in biology, we have endergonic reaction, and this root here means work. So endergonic means there has to be work inputted into that process to make it happen. And the way to remember it, anabolic, think of anabolic steroids. Anabolic steroids build up muscles. Anabolic reactions build up larger molecules like glucose from smaller molecules like carbon dioxide. And energy is required because we are decreasing entropy in these reactions. If you're taking 6 small molecules and turning them into one big molecule, that is more organized. It's less disorderly. So that means entropy has decreased. Stop ringing the bell. You're not going outside. Go lay down. The opposite of that would be catabolic reactions. Catabolic reactions take large molecules and break them into smaller bits. These reactions are downhill because entropy is increasing. Anytime you're making things more disorderly, it's generally a releasing energy kind of a process. And so you see here we use the word exergonic, not exothermic, because in biological reactions, biological systems try very hard to not change temperature and not have excessive heat. Instead, they use that released energy to do work. Energy in chemistry, the amount of, to look at potential energy and released energy, we have the concept G. G is for Gibbs free energy. Gibbs is the guy who first described it in the scientific literature. And we use the capital letter G to symbolize that free energy. So this is the formula that describes what happens to Gibbs free energy. So here's our Greek letter delta here, the little triangle, that's delta. And in science, delta stands for the word change. So when you see delta G, that means change in energy. H stands for enthalpy, which is kind of a fancy word for heat. So the change in free energy is the change in heat minus the temperature times the change in entropy. So S is entropy. And good thing for us, well, we're not going to do any calculations with this formula, so don't be alarmed. But we don't even need all this formula in biology because biological systems try really hard to not change temperature and not have excessive heat and get rid of the heat. So really, the only part of this equation that we need for biology is the change in free energy is the opposite of the change in entropy. So that means if free energy goes up during the reaction, entropy goes down. If energy goes down during the reaction, entropy is going to go up. So entropy does the opposite of whatever the free energy is doing. And when we say energy goes down, I like to think of those as a downhill reaction. That would be our exergonic reactions, things that release energy, because they start out with a higher energy and they end with a low energy, like burning sugar. That would be an exergonic reaction. The delta G is going to be negative, which means entropy is going to go up during such a reaction. So here's 3 examples of that. The first one is like our rolling the ball down the hill example. We have gravitational potential energy, which is not really used by living systems very much. But this guy had to exert some energy to get up to the top of that diving board. He had to climb a ladder. So he has some potential energy, he has some stored potential energy. When he jumps, now he has kinetic energy of motion, thanks to the energy that he input to get up there. That's potential energy. So the change in energy here is going to be negative, and entropy is going to increase. So similarly, if we have an ion gradient, so they don't really represent it across a membrane with this image, it just looks like it's a little wad in the water, but really if we're talking about diffusion as potential energy, we mean that it's across a membrane. We have a lot of something on one side of a membrane and almost none on the other side of the membrane. And if a channel is opened in the membrane, that ion can now flow into the cell or out of the cell, wherever the inequality is. And we are going to increase entropy, because if you have a whole bunch of ions piled up on one side of the membrane, that's orderly, that's more organized. To have a lot of one ion on one side of the membrane and not any on the other side of the membrane, that disequilibrium took energy to get to that. So that has potential energy. And we can release that energy by just allowing diffusion to occur, by just opening a channel, allowing those ions to flow across the membrane. Once they reach equilibrium, the energy level is low, but entropy is now high. So in all 3 of these examples, entropy is high at the end here, low up here. But the energy is the opposite. Energy is low down here, but higher up here. We have some kind of potential energy. So the third example is if we have a chemical bond as our potential energy. So here this is supposed to be a glucose molecule, and we burn the glucose molecule and we end up with water and carbon dioxide. The black is carbon, red is oxygen, white is hydrogen. We don't have any potential energy anymore down here. Carbon dioxide and water are the absolute bottom of the barrel energy-wise. Glucose, however, is more organized, so therefore it has more potential energy. Down here, we have less organization. It's more disorderly, so that means entropy is high, potential energy is low. So, and our two most important ones for biological systems, forget gravitational motion except as an example of this, because not very many biological systems are using gravitational potential energy. But ion gradients and allowing diffusion to release potential energy and breaking chemical bonds, those are both important types of potential energy for biological systems. So here's an example of how we would calculate that. And again, we're not going to do any calculations, but I'm showing you this because it's good to get a sense of whether it's negative or positive. That's the important part here. Because if the change in energy, so here's our delta G, change in free energy is negative, that means the energy went down during the reaction. And that means it's a spontaneous reaction. So here's sugar again, C6H12O6, that's glucose, combined with oxygen, produces carbon dioxide and water and energy. The energy is going to change during this reaction. So exergonic reactions that release energy are going to have a negative delta G. So that's what that tells us. Endergonic reactions, things that we have to add energy to because they have low energy at the beginning and high energy at the end, they're going to have a positive delta G. That energy had to come from somewhere. If we have a high amount of energy at the end, where did the energy come from? We have to add it to that particular reaction. Sometimes we add it using ATP, and I'll show you an example of that. So here's our two example reactions here on a graph of free energy. So on the y-axis here on both of these graphs, that's our Gibbs free energy. And the first bar is the reactants. That's what we started with. And at the end, those are the products. This is what we end with at the end of the reaction. So here's a downhill reaction. You can see why I think of these as downhill reactions. The energy is released. This reaction could potentially be used to do cellular work because it releases energy. Delta G here is negative because delta G is the final energy minus the initial energy, so that's going to be negative for this reaction. This is a spontaneous reaction. For an endergonic reaction, we have low energy at the beginning and high energy in the product. So this would be, for example, photosynthesis. We have carbon dioxide and water, and we're going to make sugar out of it. That's photosynthesis. Well, we got to add energy to that because sugar has a much higher delta G than carbon dioxide and water, which have nothing really. They don't have any potential energy at all. So that energy, this energy here, to take this big step, that has to come from somewhere. And in photosynthesis, it comes from light. So reactions that have a positive delta G are not going to occur unless we add energy to them. Even having an enzyme isn't going to help. So in biological systems, we never want to reach equilibrium because then no cellular work is being done. In fact, reaching equilibrium is one of the definitions of death, because if your cellular systems all reach equilibrium, nothing is happening. You have no metabolism anymore. So if we think of it as like what happens in a dam, you have potential energy because you have water behind the dam, and then the level of the water is much lower on the other side of the dam, so we have a disequilibrium. You can allow that water to flow through the dam over a turbine and generate electricity. That's in fact why we build dams. We build dams to create this disequilibrium so that we can generate electricity very cheaply by using just water flowing downhill using gravity. So if you don't have a way to have energy or water flowing out and new water coming in, like a river, you're going to reach equilibrium, and our cells never want to reach equilibrium. So they operate more like an open system, like what you would have if you dammed a river. You constantly have water coming in and you have water flowing out. So it does not reach equilibrium. You can have your dam sluices open all the time and have your turbine turning 24 hours a day because you have water coming in and water going out. And what our cells actually do is try to break it down step by step by step. So when we get to the respiration chapter, we will talk about how our cells take glucose, which has many bonds in it that store potential energy, and break those bonds one by one by one by one until we end up with carbon dioxide at the end. And at each step, energy is harvested and stored in ATP. And again, ATP is that RNA nucleotide that is used. It's used as the energy source for most of the reactions in your cell, for muscle contraction, for vesicle transport, for transporting sodium ions across the membrane by active transport to keep your membrane potential correct, for nerve transmission to occur, etc. It's not the only RNA nucleotide that's used for energy. As we'll see when we get to protein synthesis, GTP is another RNA nucleotide that is used for energy as well. And the T is for tri, so the A is for adenine. So ATP is adenosine triphosphate, and that means there's 3 phosphates here. And 2 of these phosphates can be removed to release a little packet of energy. So 1 phosphate can be removed, then the second phosphate can be removed, or they both can be removed at the same time to release a little bit larger packet of energy. But that's how we use ATP. And GTP is used the same way. GTP has a slightly higher amount of stored energy, so that's probably why it's used for certain reactions. So here is our adenosine triphosphate. Again, we have our adenine, our ribose, and our 3 phosphates. One ATP or 1 phosphate can be removed. That releases a little packet of energy, and now it's adenosine diphosphate. If another phosphate is removed, it's adenosine monophosphate. And that does happen, especially if the cell is starving for energy. And then you'll notice now this, so P with a circle around it is how we represent phosphate. Because remember, phosphate is a phosphorus with 3 or 4 oxygens associated with it. And this is organic phosphate because it's attached to a larger carbon-containing molecule. Organic, remember, means it has carbon in it somewhere. So ATP and ADP are organic molecules because they contain carbon. Once we break off that little phosphate, now it's inorganic because it's no longer connected to a larger carbon-containing molecule. So that's what the little I means here. So when we have a P with a circle around it and a little I, that's to tell us it's no longer part of any kind of larger organic molecule. It's inorganic now. It's inorganic phosphate. Remember, even water is inorganic because it doesn't have any carbon in it. So here's a synthesis reaction that uses ATP. So this is something that our cells do, taking one amino acid and converting it into another, glutamic acid, and converting it into glutamine. And this reaction is an uphill reaction because we're decreasing entropy. We're taking 2 separate molecules and turning them into 1 molecule. And that's normally would be an endergonic reaction. And it has a positive delta G of 3.4 kilocalories per mole. So this is going to require energy. Not only is it going to require energy, it's going to require an enzyme. And most of the reactions that take place in your cells require enzymes as well, whether they're spontaneous reactions or non-spontaneous reactions that need energy added to them. They require an enzyme. So the ATP is going to be used to turn this into a spontaneous reaction. So it's going to be a two-step reaction. The first reaction, so here's our ATP, and the glutamic acid is going to be phosphorylated. So phosphorylate is a big word, but it just means stick a phosphate on it. I'm going to stick a phosphate on it, it's phosphorylated now. And what this does, because of the electrons, remember oxygen and phosphorus are electronegative, this is going to disrupt the bonds. So bonds are just shared electrons. We have a bond between two different, let me use my little pens here. A bond between two atoms is just shared electrons. The nuclei of the two atoms are a particular distance apart, and there's electrons buzzing around and being shared. The valence electrons are being shared. That's a bond. It's extremely sensitive to distance. If I move the nuclei of those atoms just a little further apart, I really weaken that bond. If I put something electronegative nearby, that's going to draw some of the electrons away, so that now some of these buzzing electrons are spending some time over here with this phosphate. That also is going to weaken that bond, and that's what's going to turn it from a non-spontaneous reaction into a spontaneous reaction. So our intermediate, we have this glutamic acid that's phosphorylated. ADP is going to go back to be recycled. Now, this reaction is a spontaneous reaction. We can take ammonia and bind it to glutamic acid and make glutamine. So this reaction, and see the little numbers here, we're going to see this in other sections. This means that there's an enzyme used and it's a different one. So this reaction uses one enzyme. This reaction uses a second enzyme. This reaction now is spontaneous. So this first reaction here is adding the energy. Now it makes this reaction a spontaneous reaction. So that's how we use ATP for a synthesis reaction. It is able to destabilize the bonds enough to make a non-spontaneous reaction into a spontaneous reaction. And as long as the energy that's released is more than the energy that's needed, so we need 3.4 kilocalories here to make this reaction happen. And the free energy, the change in energy of converting ATP to ADP, that releases 7.3 kilocalories. So that's enough. So now our overall reaction has a change in free energy of negative 3.9 kilocalories per mole. It's now a spontaneous reaction. But keep in mind, it's actually the second one that's now the spontaneous reaction. The actual synthesis reaction has been made spontaneous because this first reaction here has had energy added to it. ATP is used for other things too. It's used for transport. We already talked a little bit in the membranes section about active transport, transporting sodium and potassium across the membrane against their concentration gradient. That uses ATP. Vesicle transport, we already talked about that. That uses ATP. And ATP can be reused, or the ADP can be recycled into ATP many, many thousands of times before that molecule wears out and becomes non-functional. And this is what we'll talk about when we get to the respiration chapter, which is next. We'll talk about how our mitochondria are continually recycling the ADP that we use for cellular work and turning it back into ATP. Here's a few other things that ATP is used for besides synthesis. Muscle contraction we talked about before. It's similar to vesicle transport that uses microtubules, except now we have actin, and myosin is walking on the actin using ATP. Sometimes enzymes are just activated by phosphorylation, and ATP can certainly do that. That's a downhill reaction for it to release one of its phosphates and have it attached to something else. Transporting things across membranes. So if we have a concentration gradient that we've used ATP to build, we can use that concentration gradient for co-transport. There's this active transport that we talked about already. Moving flagella and cilia also uses ATP. Dienes walk on the microtubules and move the flagella or cilia. Cells crawling also use ATP because that actin, the actin that's being used to make those pseudopodia, is being actively assembled using ATP as well. And sometimes ATP is just wasted for the excess heat, because every time you convert ATP to ADP or ADP back to ATP, a little bit of heat is released, because no conversion is 100% efficient. So shimmering, which many animals do, including even insects, not just mammals, is muscle movement that's designed just to release this excess heat. So that's even a function of ATP. Okay, in the next section, we will talk about enzymes and how enzymes facilitate these processes.